landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. Then he went out about 9 o'clock, and he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around. And he said to them, Why are you standing here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now when they first came, they thought that they would receive more. But each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous?" So the last will be first, and the first will be last. The Gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. September 15th, last week, which was Monday, marked 2 years since you knew I was going to be your new pastor, rector. That was when it was announced 2 years ago. It was when I and Charlotte began to think intentionally about the ministry that we would share with you here at St. Timothy's. 2 years ago. Time has gone quickly. And as I looked at this gospel lesson today, I began to kind of reflect back on some things in my life. And my folks who lived in Ohio would let me come and spend the summers when I was a boy with my grandfather and grandmother. They lived in a little community called Stamping Ground, and the reason it's called Stamping Ground is there is a spring there in Stamping Ground that the buffalo would come to and stamp the ground around the spring. Now, they've put a gate up there and locked it, but when I was a little boy, there was no lock on that gate, and I've played many a time right there at that spring, which was about a half a mile from my grandparents' home. My grandfather grew tobacco. Once the tobacco got about as tall as me, then it was time to go bale hay. And I learned about work, and I learned about getting up early from my grandfather. I learned about how neighbors help neighbors. Thinking back now, I learned a lot about life and how life was ordered and shaped through the rhythm of those summers with my grandfather and grandmother. One day, my grandfather said that we were going to go to help a neighbor load and stack his hay. So my grandfather drove the tractor and the wagon, and I stood on one side while others stood on the other side, and we threw bales up onto the wagon all day long. On the way to the barn, I have fond memories as I smelled kind of the musty and sweet smell of that hay. Memories of listening to the men. They talked about the weather. They talked about their crops. They talked about their livestock. I don't remember a single conversation about the stock market or pop psychology or divorce or children in trouble. I worked all day. I got hot. I got itchy. I got hungry. I got thirsty. And when you got thirsty, when you could take a break, everyone drank out of a common cooler. For you young people, this was long before plastic bottles and aluminum cans. And so someone had just brought a cooler with water in it and a common cup, and you would drink. You became friends quickly with those that you didn't know before, drinking from that common cooler. I hadn't been promised a wage on this day. I was there because it was a day to be with my grandfather, and I wanted to be just like him. I wanted to be him. And since everyone else was working, I would work too. So as we finished up that last bale that was now stacked in the barn, the end of the day, the neighbor pulled out his wallet and began to pay everyone. When he came to me, he reached into his pocket and pulled out some coins and gave those to me. My grandfather, who I don't remember ever being angry, except this one time, told his neighbor, I had worked as hard as everyone else. I had worked a man's work, which made me feel proud that my grandfather saw me that way. And then he said to that neighbor, it's not right that you have not paid him the same as you paid the others. That sense of fairness was impressed into me at an early age. It's stuck with me. So every time I hear or think of the phrase, a man is worthy of his hire, which is a paraphrase of Scripture, even a boy, if he does a man's work. I learned what's fair is fair as an important value to live by. And I suspect it's a value that many of you have and was impressed into you at an early age. So when we hear this parable as recorded by Matthew, it just doesn't seem fair. A landowner who had a special crop, one we know a little bit about in our part of the world, and it's not hay and it's not marijuana, but it's grapes. And he needed to harvest grapes. And it makes sense when you harvest grapes that you harvest them as quickly as possible, because we all know it's about timing when it comes to harvesting grapes. So at the crack of dawn, this vintner goes out and he finds the go-getters. He collects the early bird, gets the worm types, and he hires them on the spot. Those first responders work literally from sun up to sundown. A solid 12 hours. They're getting hot, itchy, hungry, thirsty. They work right through the heat of the day. But the vintner recognizes pretty early he's got more work than workers. And so at 9 a.m., at noon, at 3 p.m., and then just 1 hour before quitting time, the vintner keeps adding to his crew, handing out containers and telling them to fill them up with grapes. The last group goes into the vineyard and they don't have any promise of wages, which seems a little bit unusual in the behavior, this lack of an agreement for a wage. And then we see that the focus of the parable has quickly shifted to these last laborers. For whatever reason, we're not told that these last laborers had not been ready to go at first light or at all the other times. They have been standing around idle, the story tells us, and even though we aren't told why, I think when we hear this parable, we assume why these folks had been hanging out all day long idle. At the end of the harvest, when the vintner and his manager pulled out his wallet to pay everyone, he started with the most recent arrivals, those that had arrived at the end of the day. But our story says that doesn't seem to bother anyone. The fact that the longest working pickers, they now assume that this is a good sign. This vintner is generous. He has paid those who worked a little bit a whole day's wage. Wow. Well, when everyone's been paid, Matthew tells us, there is grumbling in the vineyard. The first workers knew what was fair, and this wasn't. Equal pay for equal work is fair. Equal pay for unequal work is not fair. Rewarding those who do the most work is fair. Rewarding those who do the least is not fair. Treating everyone the same is fair. Treating everyone the same when they're not the same is not fair. In Barbara Brown Taylor's sermon titled Beginning at the End, which is on this gospel parable, she has illuminated what I believe is the telling insight for us today. An insight for us and about God's generosity and God's grace to us. And how we're able to experience the now and the not yet of the kingdom of heaven, which we've had a number of parables all summer long about that. And she does it through a very simple request. She asks us to locate ourselves in this story. Who are we? And where are we in the line at the end of the day? And why do we tend to so immediately start identifying with the folks hired at the beginning? Why do we so readily assume that when God's kingdom comes, we'll be the ones who will be tempted to feel upset that we won't be recognized to have been the hardest workers of them all? You see, the story sounds very different for those that arrive at the end of the day than it does for those that have worked all day. And it's entirely possible that as far as God is concerned, we can't even see those before us or ahead of us or that laid the foundation for us. Now that we're reminded by this parable, we can probably recall all sorts of things that we don't care that much about, that others do and have done on our behalf. And there are so many things that we want to have done, we just don't want to do them. And there are so many things that we don't mean to do, that we wind up doing. Even when we manage to do our best, things get in the way. People get sick. We get tired. Relationships shift. There are lots of reasons why people wind up beginning at the end of the day. And only God can sort the reasons out. It's a good thing, too, that God is not fair, as we assume fair. Because God loves us without discrimination. And when we're expecting this discriminating equity, we're surprised to find generosity. Perhaps Jesus is trying to impress into us that this kingdom of heaven is like that weaving into our lives an attitude of gratitude as to how we will first respond to things in life. That our reward doesn't come from our individual merit. It doesn't come from the quantity or the quality of the labor, but rather this comes from the gracious covenant that's being offered to us. by the one who's been doing the hiring. Perhaps this parable is telling us God's generosity and grace is bigger than our capacity to grasp it, which is okay. But that's where faith comes in. And when we begrudge this generosity, it's only because we have confused where we are in the line from God's perspective. I'll finish with this story. Man dies. He goes to heaven. He gets to the pearly gates, and there to meet him is St. Peter. St. Peter says, here's how it works. You need 100 points to get into heaven. You tell me the good things you've done. I'll give you a certain number of points for each item, depending on how good it was. And when you reach 100 points, you can get in. Okay, the man says. I was married to the same woman for 50 years, and I never cheated on her, even in my heart. That's wonderful, said St. Peter. That's worth 3 points. 3 points? Okay, well, I attended church all of my life, and I supported its ministry and my tithe and service. Terrific, said St. Peter. That's certainly worth a point. 1 point? Well, I worked in a shelter for homeless veterans and fed the poor once a week. Fantastic. That's good for 2 more points. 2 points? At this rate, the only way to get into heaven is by the grace of God. St. Peter smiled. There's your 100 point. Come on in. Amen.